Good morning, everyone. My name is Neha Srinivasan, and I am a junior majoring in International Studies and Spanish with a minor in business. I'm also a member of the GS7, which is the Student Advisory Board to the Dean of the Hamilton Lugar School. I'd like to invite everyone to stay after this session as the award is presented to the winner of the Student Editorial Contest. And now I'm so glad that you all have joined us for this year's America's Role in the World Conference keynote speaker, Ernest J. Moniz. Secretary Moniz served as the 13th U.S. Secretary of Energy from 2013 to 2017. During these years, he most notably advanced energy technology innovations and promoted nuclear security and strategic stability. He also prioritized cutting-edge capabilities for the American scientific research community and environmental stewardship. Secretary Moniz served on the Massachusetts Institute of Technology faculty from 1973 to 2013 and is now the Cecil and Ida Green Professor of Physics and Engineering Systems Emeritus and Special Advisor to the MIT President. Furthermore, he serves as the Chief Executive Officer and Co-Chair of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to prevent catastrophic attacks with weapons of mass destruction and disruption. Secretary Moniz, we are extremely lucky and excited to be learning from you today. After his remarks, Secretary Moniz will be joined by today's moderator, Ms. Carol Giacomo. Ms. Giacomo's years of experience in foreign and defense issues has made her a notable expert in this field. She joined the New York Times editorial board in 2007 and is known for her editorials concerning the leading national security challenges faced by America and both the world today. Before her position with the New York Times, she was the diplomatic correspondent for Reuters in Washington. During her time with Reuters, she traveled over 1 million miles to more than 100 countries, and we are lucky that she has traveled just a few more miles to be with us here in Bloomington today. Now, if you all would, please join me in giving a warm welcome to both Secretary Moniz and Ms. Carol Giacomo.
Thank you. Well, thank you, despite the cruelty of noting that I started on the faculty in 1973. But that's nothing compared to last night, because I actually have a long history here at Indiana and in physics. And it was pointed out last night when I met with one of my colleagues that we had even published before 1973. But really, I spent a lot of time here in the 70s and the 80s. Some of you may remember the Indiana University cyclotron facility and lots of stories, but we won't go there. But of course, I'm also, of course, very thrilled and honored to be here with my good friends and heroes, Lee Hamilton and Dick Lugar. You all know they're I'm not going to bother to tell people here in Indiana about their roles in foreign policy and national security, but I will add that the pleasure that I've had in working with both of them, with Lee in particular, in 8-9 years ago, working with him on the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future that he co-chaired with Brent Scowcroft. And I'll just note, Lee, the recommendations keep sitting there warm. I actually have optimism that the recommendations around spent fuel storage are actually going to finally get legislated, possibly in this Congress. There's a lot of motion actually on this end. I'll just say that the issue of resolving the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle, the spent fuel management, actually has very profound non-proliferation consequences, because if we can manage that, we may be able to manage the issue of other countries not developing enrichment or reprocessing capability. So anyway, this is actually a note of optimism that I see some real motion there. And with Dick Lugar, I also work a lot, a real lot with former Senator Sam Nunn, and Lugar and Nunn are names that go together for the enormous role that they played in responding to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of Russia in terms of securing nuclear weapons, nuclear materials and the like, the non-Lugar program, and cooperative threat reduction technically, but everybody knows as non-Lugar. And I want to say that Dick is on our board at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, so we continue to benefit from what he's doing. But also, just to say that, again, in terms of things that may not be as well known here, but just we continue to push, following the leadership of Dick and Sam Nunn, on the idea that that program, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, may also be a model of how we help the implementation of an agreement, if we can reach it, with North Korea. And they published a piece on that not so long ago. So anyway, I think their imprint is still very much alive and going forward. And so we're quite pleased by that. So let me turn to today's subject in terms of averting. By the way, on the North Korea, perhaps we'll come back to that in the discussion. I think there is much to say that. But today we're talking more about nuclear arms races, the potential for a new one. This inevitably means we're talking, frankly, about U.S. and Russia, which together still possess, despite a lot of progress in reducing the number of weapons and in some cases the number of classes of missiles, et cetera, which may be coming back, that we possess 92% roughly of the nuclear weapons in the world. So that's the reality there. Secondly, let me say that just to clarify that at NTI, organizationally, not surprising, we join in the aspiration of many that we will get to a world without nuclear weapons. But if I actually talk about what we do, what we really do is try to address the issue of the risk of a nuclear weapon being used and obviously mitigating that risk. That's really our focus, that what are the practical steps we can take. I think it's in the tradition of non-Lugar, frankly. What are the practical steps one can take to reduce risks on what is certainly, has to be almost certainly a very, very long road towards hopefully realizing that aspiration. Today, I hate to say, but I believe it is correct, certainly in my view, that risk of a nuclear weapon use is higher than at any time since the Russian missile crisis. I'm sorry, the Cuban Missile Crisis with the Soviet Union at that time. That is not because of a judgment that somehow U.S. and Russia are likely to launch, major nuclear attack on each other, but we think, and I'll say more about this, that the conditions that could lead to miscalculation, unintended escalation, are growing. That can be from military to military misunderstanding, in the absence of any significant level of discussion going on today. It can result from cyber threats. I'm not talking about a hacker, shooting off an ICBM from North Dakota. What I'm talking about is cyber intrusions into the command and control system, for example, leading to false information going to one or the other leader, and in a situation where we have an unconscionably short decision time for those leaders, again, leading to potentially a blundering into an escalatory situation. And so these are really, really major concerns. And as I've already hinted, in a situation in which U.S.-Russia dialogue, and I don't mean necessarily at the leader level, but at the important working levels, military to military, diplomatic to diplomatic, working groups that frankly roll up their sleeves and work hard at solving problems the way we used to in the Cold War. It just doesn't exist, and there is paralysis. The reality is there is no political space right now for anybody who wants to carry on a constructive discussion with Russia to do so. And that's, of course, this is not a political statement, this is a statement of fact. Obviously, our president currently does not have the confidence, I would say, of either political party in dealing with Russia. So there's, again, even in the areas where one should, it's hard to do that. But I have to say also Congress is part of that contraction of the political space. And I'll give you a very, very clear example. Last year, Congress passed some sanctions, economic sanctions, on Russia. And there are certainly very good motivations when you look at election interference, you look at Ukraine and the like. But what Congress also did, and later on I'd be happy to have our experienced people from Capitol Hill make some comments on it, but what Congress did is something that was rarely done in the past. When it was done, I believe, to unintended consequence, and that was to preclude the president or the executive from having waiver authority, let's say in response to some progress. Well, to be blunt, if you're going to rely on Congress to be the waiver lifting authority, you got a serious political misalignment of incentives. And that was demonstrated in the past, and that is the situation in which we find ourselves today. And if that is the situation, then it acts as an additional barrier to conversations, because on the Russian side, if you can't get out of jail free card, your motivation for actually engaging in the important discussions of mutual existential security interest is obviously diminished. This is nothing about getting a free pass on Ukraine or on election interference and the like. But in the Cold War, and these gentlemen were, of course, in the Congress at that time, in the Cold War, we could always compartment that into addressing the mutual national security and nuclear risks. And unfortunately, I don't think we are there right now. We certainly do not have the kinds of crisis management situations or mechanisms in functioning that we had in the past, and all of this is leading to a compromise of the strategic stability situation that we had in the past, a situation that is made more difficult today by factors like the cyber threat to command and control, which was not an issue 30 years ago or so when we were addressing these things. Obviously, there's a lot of concern that we are seeing before our eyes the crumbling of the remainder of the arms control structures, the edifice that's been put in place, hard won over many decades, really going back to the 70s. Then, of course, in the 80s, very, very importantly, the INF coming into the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that eliminated an entire class of weapons and missiles and weapons deployments at the NATO-Soviet interface. Now, the United States announcing its withdrawal there. Again, it's not as though there are not reasons in the sense that I will endorse the statement that Russia has introduced a non-compliant system. The Russians also accuse us of being non-compliant. But the reaction that this automatically means withdrawal is a conclusion that I don't get the dots that get you from one end to the other end, as opposed to establishing the kinds of mechanisms of inspection that you need to sit down and try to resolve these issues, sustaining the European situation that the INF has put in place, and frankly, not using red herrings like China's situation as an excuse to leave the system. So this has been very, very difficult and not in our national security interest, and certainly in my view. But of course, and then now we're all concerned. And technically, we're still in the period of trying to fix the INF, but I think generally speaking, 10 to the minus a large number is the probability that is being assigned to to survival of the INF. And of course, then comes the major issue of the New START treaty, and if that is not renewed, and that expires in 2021, it has an automatic mechanism essentially for a 5-year extension. What we should be doing, in my view, is taking that extension and realizing that that extra 5 years maybe gives us the time to negotiate various issues needed to go forward. But instead, a lot of us fear that we're going to run that same movie in terms of getting out, and that would be the end of decades and decades of having some verifiable limits on our nuclear weapons situations, and it does conjure back up the well-known theory of holes. When you find yourself in one, stop digging. But that does not seem to be the approach that we are taking. And I would just note that when you put the issue of INF this year, 2019, for reasons which will become clear, the bookend of New START extension in 2021, and the prospects maybe not looking so great, there is a less talked about major issue in 2020 between the bookends, and that is the every 5-year non-proliferation treaty review conference. This is not looking promising, and this also comes in the wake of the zero movement, Peace Prize awarded for that movement last year. If it looks as though the big players in this game are clearly going in the opposite direction to the long-term NPT commitments, it's hard to see how what has already been a very contentious process that we look forward to every 5 years, it's hard to see how that is not going to be very, very tough. And if we start, and we should remember, when all is said and done, it really is the NPT that is in many ways the real foundation of the whole nuclear nuclear proliferation issue. And if that starts crumbling, Katie bar the door. It's going to be a big deal. So we are in a very, very important period, and we certainly will keep doing what we can to try to stay on the rails. But it's going to be difficult. Another factor working against stability is. And again, no one's announced a policy, but if you look at policies that are being discussed in both Russia and the United States, a real question is, are we sliding back to the idea that nuclear weapons are not a deterrent, but somehow have utility as battlefield weapons? The argument is disguised as deterrence, but it's really talking about usability. Small nuclear weapons. A small nuclear weapon makes a very bad day. This is being discussed as like 5 kiloton weapons. I remind you that 5 kilotons is quite a blast, not to mention the radioactivity and all the other consequences. So unfortunately, the United States, in the Nuclear Posture Review the administration put out in 2018, explicitly talks about and is implementing the deployment of so-called small nuclear weapons on missiles. By the way, we already have small weapons. They are forward deployed in Europe. That's not a secret with our bomber fleet. But whatever the case, it is a weakening of the deterrence argument that a nuclear weapon use, let's say by Russia, and there are heated arguments about Russia's policy potentially being so-called escalate to de-escalate in a position of conventional security inferiority, potentially deploying a small nuclear weapon with the idea that it will somehow de-escalate tensions. It's hard for us to see it not leading in the opposite direction. So this is another very, very dangerous discussion that's going on in the background. So, and that's not even getting into the issue of new capabilities being discussed, like hypersonic vehicles and subsea devices that could take out coastal areas. So lots and lots of factors. So let me just say, before we get into the discussion with Carol, a few steps. This is hardly a comprehensive way, but some steps. One is to go back to the issue of political space and the desperate need we have to increase that and unleash the possibility of professional discussions on, again, mutual security interests. One of the suggestions that we've made, Sam Nunn and I have put forward, is to return to a mechanism that was employed in the 1980s, where in that case it was the Senate. Now we would argue for a bicameral bipartisan. Then it was a Senate bipartisan group, an arms control group, formed by the senior leadership of the Senate with the White House blessing to work with the Department of State. In that time, George Shultz was the Secretary of State, and I think you can see how that can have many, many beneficial results, especially when you, in the light of what I said earlier about the congressional contraction of the political space. If Congress is involved, it's a signal then that there is a chance to have discussions on some of these key topics and maybe have them implemented going forward. So that's an example of something. Secondly, at NTI, 2 years ago, in collaboration with a sister organization in Moscow called CNES, we put together, both sides together, we put together 51 projects that we felt could profitably and sensibly be done because of common interest going forward. One of those has been going forward, only one out of 51, and that is that, and that's because all the activity occurs in third countries. But for example, it is about avoiding dirty bomb materials in the Central Asian republics. These are all old Soviet sources, and now it would behoove both the United States and Russia to see that those kinds of terrorist threats in that region go away. So there is some motion there, but there's 50 more to go. The good news, I would say, is that last year, in the lead up to the Trump-Putin summit, we and others, with U.S. government, discussion, put forward a bunch of a set of additional ideas that could in fact be maybe a next set to go forward following the summit if the political space could be formed. And frankly, and we went to Russia, and the Russians made it clear they were prepared to go this way. Everybody seemed lined up. The summit outcome didn't end the way we might have wished, and so it's back on hold. Still sitting there. It's warm, but until we get the political space, they can't go forward. But those are examples of some things we could do. In terms of reestablishing dialogue, crisis management, and the like. One of the outcomes of the summit was an explicit commitment to resume strategic stability talks. Unfortunately, they essentially haven't happened. Another thing that's waiting there, it's kind of on the shelf, but we just got to get the political space, again, for the military collaborations and the like. And finally, let me just mention one other thing, which is broader, actually, broader than these issues of U.S.-Russia. There are many other things, but maybe we'll touch some of those in the discussion, is sanctions and sanctions policy. Frankly, and it does not, let me make it very clear, this did not start with the Trump administration. It goes back further, although it has been accelerated in the Trump administration. And I would say is, in my own characterization, technical term, willy-nilly, reverting to sanctions as the preferred diplomatic tool for any damn thing that we have to address. I want to point out, and it's appropriate in ending, that any of my first remarks, that, again, our two friends here, Lee Hamilton and Dick Lugar, maybe they have forgotten that in the late 90s, they introduced legislation, it did not get passed, on sanctions. And the idea that sanctions, they independently introduced bills in the House and the Senate that proposed guardrails on the executive's use of sanctions, public comment period, expiration date, et cetera, ways of handling the waiver, to use popular terms today, waivers and emergency declarations that is much in the news today, et cetera. A bunch of issues. All I'm saying is that if we continue to use waivers as our principal security and diplomatic tool, we at some point will find the slippery slope that we are on to potentially profound changes in the world financial institutional structure, including, and I don't want to sound overly dire, but things like the dollar as the reserve currency. People are getting tired of this. And especially now that we are beginning to use this as a tool against our allies, big deal. This is not a deal for next year. Maybe it's 10 years, I don't know. But I think that this is an example of we are playing with fire. We are playing with the basic pillars of our geopolitical strength. Alliances. There's nothing like NATO in the world other than NATO. Russia doesn't have it. China doesn't have it, et cetera. The financial structures we've put on are enormously important to the United States. The trade relationships that we have spent so long building up under fire. Are we converting from a values-based foreign policy to a transactional one? If we are, it's a losing game for us. So these are big, big forces that are in play right now. Again, the U.S.-Russia situation we discussed in terms of arms races and stability, but these even go beyond just the U.S.-Russia relationship. Frankly, they obviously go directly to the issue of the future relationship of the U.S. and China. We heard some of that discussion in the last panel for a different reason, and how that world order is going to shape up. So my appeal is that civil society be very engaged in these discussions. Frankly, if these don't become at least something of a voting issue it's going to be very, very hard to make progress. These are tough issues. They're not the kinds of things that are debated every day at the coffee shop. They're probably not going to be that, but I think we need to elevate this, and certainly here at the Hamilton Lugar School, it's a great place to start. Thank you.
Well, Secretary Moniz certainly got my attention. I came with questions, and I have probably double that many. Let's start. I mean, you and Senator Nunn have really talked in apocalyptic terms about impending nuclear disaster. Usually when somebody is faced with an existential threat like that, they at least pay attention to it. Why do you think, I mean, apart from, I get the polarization in this country, I get all of the tensions that have been between the United States and Russia, particularly in recent years, but nevertheless, facing this potential for a renewed nuclear conflict, even by, or more so by mistake, why aren't the leadership, and why isn't the leadership on both sides more seized with the issue? I mean, when you talk with American leaders and with Russian leaders, do they just say, this will never happen?
Well, first let me start with a glimmer of hope.
Let's go dark.
And then we'll come back to what I really think. But I think the glimmer of hope is that, and again, I want to make it very clear, it's not a partisan statement, but with the change in leadership in the House, that has opened up the aperture for actually bringing these issues now into the hearing context, into some fundamental reevaluations of nuclear posture. That's already happened. Chairman Smith has already held hearings, and I think he and now ranking member Thornberry, I think, do have a good working relationship. So we've been asked we at NTI have been asked to do some support for anybody on both sides of the aisle who would like to have some of these issues explained. So again, I don't want to be Pollyannish, but I do think there is at least a resurfacing of the issues. Right. Now, that may lead to some very difficult situations because, let's face it, one of the major issues driving that reevaluation, in addition to the fundamental policy questions, is the money question and the modernization of the nuclear fleet, not fleet in terms of boats, the nuclear enterprise, and current estimates of $1.2 trillion. It's a lot of money, although, as I think we heard earlier, that's kind of the bill for Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's a 1.2 trillion, again, over 30 years, not over a couple of years. But even more than that, as a reminder that there was, let's face it, we all know that there was a deal cut. And that deal was full modernization at $1 trillion plus of the triad and ratification by the Senate of New START. That's another potential kind of casualty if we go forward with this issue of not doing New START. So it could get exciting, shall we say, and very, very contentious, but getting at least the issues on the table again is, in my view, probably a net good thing. But on the other side of the coin is, I think, with your question, I think this paralysis I referred to is a major issue. I'm not going to name names, but we do talk to let's say below the cabinet level, but at the action officer level in the government, and nobody knows how to move right, left, forward, back. They just sit there and wait for things to go. when the Mueller investigation is finished, there may or may not be more space coming in. But that's a big issue. And finally, I think that we have to be honest as well that there are some forces in both countries that are looking forward to diversifying their nuclear weapons and delivery systems. So there's a lot of forces here that we have to contend with, but I still go back, I think number one, get the political space and get the commitment to working level interactions.
You mentioned that there was potential in the House because the Democrats now are in control there. What about the Senate? I mean, are you finding these issues are getting more and more compelling, it seems to me, and are you seeing any more interest on the side of Senate leaders to grapple with these issues?
Well, some, but I would say not as much as in the House, to be perfectly honest. The issues have been brought to the attention. In particular, my colleague, Sam Nunn, Sam, I should say, is, I've taken over as co-chairman and CEO, but Sam remains as a co-chairman. And we've both had very senior level discussions in both chambers. So the possibilities are there. But, you know, we're getting into the way it works. We are already, I guess, now into the presidential election season. And really the question is, are we going to be able to get national security issues, including these national security issues, onto the agenda?
Who's driving the debate in this country on this sort of relook at nuclear weapons as something that has viability, viability for use as opposed to just a deterrent?
Well, I think there's quite a lot of that right now in the White House, but I'll just leave it at that.
And you mentioned that at the summit between Putin and Trump, that it sounded to me like you said that the Russians had gone into that meeting open to some sort of continuing dialogue and strategic stability talks or whatever, but it didn't happen.
But let me just clarify, Carol. I said yes, but I think that was also true on the American side. That again, I don't mean at the president level, but down there was a preparation on both sides, I think, to get into some of these practical things. It's not necessarily solving all the macro problems, but getting into these confidence building, trust building, mutual addressing of mutually important issues. And frankly, if you look at the Russian statements after the summit, including by President Putin, there was a very, very strong suggestion that those issues were in fact addressed. The strategic stability talks was one of the few announcements that was jointly agreed to. But as you know, the post-summit communications did not enhance the opportunity to move forward. I at least had hope that a second discussion between Presidents Trump and Putin in Argentina was going to maybe unlock some of those possibilities. But then, of course, came the issue in Ukraine again, in Crimea, the Russian impoundment of the Ukrainian vessels and sailors, and so that didn't happen. And once again, this same theme, nobody's talking to anybody. Right.
On the INF Treaty, there was a story, I think yesterday, that the Pentagon was preparing for some tests of INF category missiles. If you were in office tomorrow, and you were advising a new president, is there a way?
I thought you meant in that office.
Oh,
No.
Well, okay, all right. Be president. How would you go about? What are the first three things that you would do to try to reverse the deterioration of what we're seeing now?
Well, number one, I would just trigger the 5-year review on a 5-year, extension on New START, making it clear that that now the 7 years that we have would be the time to start, to establish and exercise real discussions about what's the next step in strategic arms control, and further numbers reduction hopefully would be part of that, but that is by no means, in my view, the most important part. I mean, the numbers at this stage are, to me, less important than various other issues. That's number one. Number two, clock's running out, but again, I think that the path forward on INF extension is pretty clear. It is a statement that, okay, we will indeed establish the joint technical verification mechanisms to address both sides on this. I don't mean it's easy, but you can't get there if you don't have those teams put together. Be largely military to military discussions. I think that would be an important step. And as I said, China should not confuse that discussion. Right. There should be separate discussions about how do we start and what's the ramp up now to get serious arms control discussions that do engage China, because this is not the 1980s anymore. It's a very, very different world. China's economy is very, very different, obviously, right, et cetera. And a third area, but it all hinges upon getting that dialogue going again, which is very important, is this decision time issue. And Sam Nunn has said this very, very eloquently, that if you're President Trump or President Putin or their successors, frankly, or their predecessors, you should not be happy with a few minutes of decision time on these issues. And our recommendation would be that the presidents tell their militaries, you get together, you work together, and your objective is step-by-step increase of decision time. You don't start by going from 10 minutes to 10 days, but you go step by step, keep lengthening that, and that then changes the entire strategic situation in terms of stability.
And with INF, would you, again, if you were president, if you were king, would you reassert or reaffirm America's commitment to the treaty and just work with Russia around that, with hopes of trying to get Russia back into the actual framework?
Yeah, that both sides then get back to a framework where we say there is compliance with this. I might just add that, because I mentioned in a different context, you have to say, deteriorating situation between us and our allies. And obviously INF is one example. There clearly was nothing like the kinds of consultations that should occur in a treaty that was of such immense importance to NATO and to the individual European countries. Germany might have something to say about it, for example. And that's just now adding to a whole stack of issues. The Iran agreement, the Paris Agreement on climate, you go on and on and on, where basically threatening sanctions, trade, not threatening, imposing tariffs on allies, et cetera. There is clearly a underappreciation, shall we say, of the importance of that alliance system, the importance of NATO, and what it means to our security.
You talk just in passing about trying to find a way to bring China into arms control negotiations. What are you thinking about that, and why do you say China, not also India, Pakistan, which has the fastest growing nuclear arsenal in the world? Those all, Israel too.
Well, no,
France and Britain.
No, sure. Look, eventually you need to bring everyone in it, but I think there is a logic which goes, for one thing, according to the size of the countries, the size of the arsenals, et cetera, and we often forget here that Russia and China are heavily nuclear-armed countries with a long border. We sit here between the oceans, and so it's a very, very different calculation. The Soviet-European interface was a similar thing, and that's where in the 80s and things like INF came in. So I think there is a reason there, but look, you can imagine starting with 2, going to 3, maybe going to 5, the P5 first, and talking about maybe some joint policies like around joint declarations that nuclear weapons will never be used against non-nuclear weapon states. If that was a clear commitment of the P5, that would be a big deal. Now, why not India, Pakistan, North Korea, Israel? That would be great too.
Right.
But the reality is, it's harder for me to see how that goes on the same pace because there are so many regional security issues wrapped around this. In fact, I think there's a legitimate question, which is very, very different from the 1980s. Can the big nuclear issues ultimately be resolved, even in principle, in isolation? Aren't they really part and parcel of regional security solutions? North Korea denuclearization. Is that really just a discussion about nuclear weapons? Of course not. North Korea is, right or wrong, I mean, it's easy to see why they are very, very concerned about their overall security situation.
Right.
India, Pakistan, the same thing. And much of this is always about the enormous asymmetries that have grown because of conventional weapons, and precision strike and the like. So ultimately, I think these big issues are going to have to get resolved in broader security context, and most of those are regional issues. And that's why that might follow later.
And it'll be more complex.
Be more complex. But there are some things, like the thing I just mentioned as an example, well, maybe that's a viable nuclear issue, and then it has even the obvious factor of providing one less reason for countries to go nuclear. Right. So those are the kinds of things that I think we could do.
I'm going to ask you one more and then open it to the audience because I'm sure people have a lot of questions. You rightly flagged cyber intrusions, cybersecurity as a major issue and one which can lead to catastrophe. Is there a place, can we do arms control in the cyber realm? Is that even possible?
It's very tough. But what we've suggested is, I said earlier, actually, that, we have at NTI our aspiration, but what we focus on is, kind of look down and take steps that at least make things better. And if you take enough steps, maybe we finally get where we're going. So here in cyber, what we've said is we would support, once again, starting with US and Russia, just because of the size of the arsenals. And we're not going to get into, classified cyber exchanges. But we could get into rules of the road. We could get into pledges of not interfering, making sure that there's a bright line. We will not get involved in cyber intrusions into the other's nuclear weapons command and control system. Again, is that, are you going to believe it, et cetera? You're probably going to still try to take defensive steps. But the reality is these are all steps that can build more confidence. Ultimately, and I don't know how to get there, but ultimately you need this to be a universal norm. because clearly the perpetrators don't have to be the United States and Russia. They don't even have to be nation states.
Right.
And so, but see, these things are linked. Maybe the best thing you can do about responding to cyber threats to command and control system is to increase decision time. Mm-hmm. So, that's why these things are all linked.
All right, who wants to ask a question? The woman with the long hair.
Hi, thank you both for being here. So the question I want to ask, you talked a lot about getting nuclear arms control into civil society. So discussed more. So how do you suggest doing that when there's so much more kind of political will and momentum and seeming urgency on other things, such as, say, climate change, healthcare, what to do about things like the Mueller investigation and constant scandals out of the White House? How do we refocus onto nuclear arms control?
Talk about it in your dorm tonight, or if you're in a dorm, I don't know. No, I mean, I think, look, first of all, I think it's very important that this is not about projecting fear. It's about projecting what is a major threat to future generations in particular, and it's not to displace, let's say, climate change as a risk. It's to say that we have a set of risks that need management. And they come in very different flavors. They have different time, they have different rhythms. Like climate change is a slow motion train wreck. Nuclear is the risk of a low probability but catastrophic event. By the way, another thing, I'll advertise for NTI, another thing that we have built up dramatically in the last few years is response to biothreats, particularly from engineered biothreats, given all of the advances and the democratization of advances like gene editing and synthetic biology, CRISPR, et cetera, et cetera. So these are, so look, we have a, frankly, I could say another big risk management issue is going to be, and it's connected to climate, but is how are we going to handle 9 billion, 10 billion people, especially in a world of large environmental impacts where those who are least wealthy are the most exposed, creating possible big disruptions and security threats. So all I'm saying is, look, there are a whole set of issues that are very tough in our politics because they do have long time frames to respond to, but it is a risk management issue that the public needs to be aware about, especially in thinking about next generations. I might say something, this is public. Our largest contributor to NTI is someone who you know very well, at least by name, Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett is a risk manager in his investments. And that's the kind of thing that we need to kind of get across. This is what it's about, managing these risks in ways that make sense for us and our next generations.
Question over here.
But we can't do it if you all don't talk about it.
Hello. I just wanted to start off by saying I really enjoyed your talk this morning. I've been looking forward to this for weeks now. And during your keynote, one thing that piqued my interest was your discussion on our over-reliance on sanctions as a tool of diplomacy. Why do you think there is such an over-reliance on sanctions, and what are some alternatives that politicians could use instead, especially concerning the nuclear issue?
Well, the reliance on sanctions is it's an easy thing to fall back on. You don't have boots on the ground, and the United States is uniquely positioned to use those sanctions because of our role in the international financial system. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that if if a transaction in dollars happens between country X and country Y, that dollar goes through a U.S. bank and is subject to sanctions enforcement, et cetera. So it's very seductive in that sense. And I'm certainly not arguing that it's not a tool to be used, but I think it's got to be used much, much more selectively. And in other cases, there's something called diplomacy that might be tried. Give diplomacy a chance, kind of a thing. So again, it's a tool, but in my view, it is being way overused. It has become like the default tool, and when the rest of the world, including our allies, start saying enough is enough, we are risking a major thing. I mean, again, I'm not here to be the fear monger, et cetera, but if we don't become more selective, imagine that there is another, let's say, reserve currency. I don't mean necessarily even a displacement, but just another. That could have profound financial consequences for us, our debt structure and all kinds of things. And we should remember that, first of all, the EU collectively, 28 or 27 countries, is a very large economy. The euro, frankly, if the political situation in Europe were more coherent, maybe the euro would already be primed there. But the other reality is, we all know, certainly in your lifetime, and hopefully in mine, hopefully in my lifetime, but not that the result is good. But look, China is going to have not just the biggest economy in the world, they're going to have an economy twice as big as ours in not so long. Are we really going to preserve all the structures of today with an economy of one country that's double ours? We've got to be working now to help reshape that order that accommodates that reality in some way. And I would argue, going back to the sanctions thing, all we are doing is helping to speed up a process that could end badly.
We have time for one quick last question. Up there.
Hello, my name is Tyler Combs. I am a junior studying political science and Russian East European studies. Thank you both so much for being here. This has been an excellent discussion. Mr. Secretary, in your remarks previously, you've touched upon the role that the security dilemma caused by an asymmetry of conventional arms and the role that plays in driving a state to enhance its nuclear arsenal. And we see that decision-making playing out even in regards to Russia, which its renewed aggression in the international stage is attributable in part to the security dilemma it believes it faces in regards to NATO's eastward expansion. So kind of thinking about that, my question would be, how do you believe that what actions do you believe we can take on the front of conventional arms to supplement efforts to reduce nuclear proliferation and avert a nuclear arms race?
Well, I just think that, especially with regard to the U.S. and Russia, that I think Russia is certainly, they've been very clear. They are very concerned about our precision global strike capabilities, and they have viewed that very much in the context of nuclear deterrence, so I think we need to have that discussion broadened to include those conventional weapons, and that's why I think that our move to take the lead in eliminating the arms control structures is very, very much counter to our interests, because frankly, it's removing constraints on Russia rather than allowing us just to go forward and discuss the future in a situation where, bluntly, we will retain significant conventional superiority, But the question is, how do you negotiate that to give Russia the security it feels it needs? And that's going to be very tough with Russia doing things like what it did in Ukraine and the election meddling. So it's not easy, you know. But all I'm saying is, get at it. You know, I'm going to, maybe I'll just end by going back to the Iran negotiation.
He was a key figure in this.
Well, you know, in the end, then I kind of co-negotiated. It was co-negotiated with John Kerry, Secretary of State. But the point is, you know, when you think about this, first of all, all right, already it's unique to have two cabinet members on both sides doing a negotiation. And by the way, spending 19 straight days to get the deal done in Vienna. I mean, so the importance attached to that cannot be disputed in that, which was very important in a second feature. It was not a unilateral or bilateral negotiation. We, the United States, were the face-to-face negotiator representing the P5 plus Germany and the EU. I remind you, this is 2015, well after the Ukraine issues, and yet Russia and the United States could cooperate in this. Think forward, you know, in North Korea, it's going to have to end up as a multilateral activity. The structure of the teams put together, enormous. And for the United States, for example, the DOE laboratories were the place where, you know, as we propose new ideas to stay within our red lines, et cetera, our laboratories were doing things. Everything works, like including 9 hours of time difference between Vienna and Livermore Laboratory in California, so that when we went to bed, they would do the analysis, and in the morning, we'd have the results. I'm just giving you as an example of, that's what you need. You need a big commitment, an organized, structured team, and that's where, frankly, we have seen the problems with trying to wing it, frankly, without that kind of groundwork being done. We're not going to get there without that. We've got to change our approach. And whether you like the Iran deal or not isn't the issue. That's the kind of structure we're going to have to solve any of these problems.
Before we say thank you to Secretary Moniz, I just want to remind you that Dean Feinstein is going to announce the winner of the award to the student who there was a contest for op-ed writing, and so there's an award that's going to be presented right after this. But thank you very much, Secretary.
Thank you.
It was great.
Thank you. Good.